welcome to this episode of the Your Day, Your Rules podcast. I'm Michael.
And I'm Sev, and you're about to listen to some provocative chat about the frustrations many of us feel at work.
Offering practical tips to reach your authentic potential and insights gained from our professional experience.
Whatever your background, come and join us at a secret water cooler conversation.
Let's begin. Sev, in this episode, we're going to discuss imposter syndrome. Can you tell me what your understanding is of the term?
Sure, Michael. I think, put simply, imposter syndrome really is the experience of feeling like a phony, essentially. And it's as though at any moment you're sort of going to be found out that you're a fraud and like you don't belong where you are. And you kind of just got there through dumb luck, even though you went through the interviewing stage and you got the contract and you were given a seat and a table sort of thing. But it feels like at any moment someone's going to kind of tap on your shoulder and say, yeah, that was through dumb luck and you don't really belong here. And I think it can really affect anyone, no matter their social status, work, background, skill level, degree or expertise, really. And I think in a study that was done in the US recently, or I think it may have been in 2020 actually, they said that 1/3 of young people suffer from it and about 70% of people will likely experience it during their lifetime at
70%.
some stage. Yeah, it's pretty hefty, isn't it? That's a big statistic.
That's astonishing. If you look at it from a medical perspective, perhaps, if you, as a public health issue, thought that 70% of people were suffering from something, you'd be throwing money at it.
You would be,
left, right, and
absolutely. And I mean, there has been a massive shift, I think, in the recent years where we're sort of looking at the physicality of what health means, and now starting to sort of dive deeper into the emotional and psychological things that people are up against. But imposter syndrome is one of those that doesn't necessarily feature as much right now, isn't it? It's kind of depression and bipolar and anxiety and all of that. And there is close links to imposter syndrome with all of those other bits that kind of come through as well. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. What do you think? Have you experienced that kind of feeling before, like you're going to be found out to be a fraud? It's not really, you're not really deserving of having a place here.
Well, I think we discussed a fair amount of our backgrounds in the previous episodes, and it was a persistent theme about this constant feeling of, at some point, there's going to be a little tap on your shoulder. You're going to turn around and there's going to be somebody there saying, oh, no, not you. We've clocked you now, out you go.
Yeah.
Like waiting for the men in grey suits. As I've got older, I've tried less to attach labels to myself, because I think when you attach a mental label to yourself, then your mind will start looking for evidence that it's true.
That's very true. Yeah.
And I think you have to be careful what you invite into your head. And when we think about the term imposter, there is a negative connotation, almost like it's fraudulent behavior, and fraudulent behavior is like criminal behavior.
Yes.
And so in your mind, you can start criminalizing yourself.
Absolutely.
So even though you might have the features of it, giving yourself that label might be counterproductive for your own well-being and your own sort of mental health.
Yeah.
But definitely examining whether these thoughts are there and how I can deal with it, it's something that I've considered over time. And I think the original research was from the late 70s, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I believe so. 1978, I think there were a couple of professors, weren't there? Yeah.
And then it's come sort of more to prominence over time. But I think what tends to happen with academic research is it's very specific. So it focuses on one population. And I think in the original research, it was successful white women who were butting up against the glass ceiling and were feeling these intense and persistent feelings of inadequacy, of feeling that they didn't fit or didn't belong, despite evidence or convincing evidence to the contrary. So I think the key parts of that definition are sort of the feelings of persistence. So it's not something that comes and goes.
Yes, it's there kind of all the time, niggling at you.
Yeah, it's like the clown in It.
Oh gosh,
it's there under the surface, and it's there. It's lurking.
That's horrifying.
And then you come to it, and you can see the little eyes in the sewer. So it's there, whatever you're doing in most scenarios,
Mm.
and then the flip side of that is the convincing evidence to the contrary.
Yes.
So despite you attaining fantastic success or reaching elevated positions within work or your profession, you still have that sense of, oh, I'm not good enough, or it's not enough, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be discovered.
Yeah, it's actually one of the forms of, imposter syndrome. I think it really, really kind of anchors in on that, which is I think the expert. So you're trying to sort of, level up with all sorts of knowledge and skills and continually trying to um uh, fill up your knowledge bank essentially, so that no one can sort of say you don't belong, but
Or question
actually,
you. Yeah,
actually you're exhausting yourself, you're burning yourself out, and kind of always thinking it's not enough, it's not enough. So it's a vicious cycle of
that's really interesting.
yeah,
Yeah,
continually going up against it. But I think one of the things that you touched upon earlier, which I find really interesting, and it would be lovely to kind of try and discover some of this, is looking at the research that's been done in the past and looking at the sample size of that research and who was actually surveyed or took part in the research. It would be really interesting to have a look at the intersectionality of the people who actually filled up that sample. Um, on the basis that, how many white women were there versus white men, and then how many black women were there or Asian women were there versus white women. So even when we talk about the pay gap and things like that, a lot of the time, um, some of this stuff is based upon a majority of a certain type of person who is in that research, and we're
absolutely,
forming opinions
absolutely.
and writing history based on that. So it would be quite interesting to take a look into that.
I think that's right. As we discussed earlier, the original research focused on a very specific demographic, but as time has gone on and the term has become popularized, it's mushroomed out into lots of different demographics of people. And when we look at it, it doesn't really sort of discuss things like systemic racism or class bias
Yeah.
or gender orientation. It's specifically focused on
A particular
a
group of
particular
people.
type of person.
Yeah, absolutely, and interestingly, this was one of the things that really caught my attention. When you do, you go into WebMD or Psychology Today, or even the Financial Times had articles about imposter syndrome, and a lot of the bullet points about how it actually comes to be were repetitive. And a lot of people could probably look at that and say, yeah, oh yeah, I can see how that could have led to imposter syndrome on a
Yeah,
personal front. Some of the things that it wasn't capturing, though, is again going back to our sort of cultural background and what we were wired to believe in terms of you have to work harder, you have to keep your head down, you have to just get on with it, or the external world will make it known to you that you don't belong. And I think there's um, a significant amount of research and insight that can actually come through if
uh,
people were to do new
for
research
sure.
with some bigger groups of marginalized communities in that sample, you know?
I completely agree with you. And if you think about different people's life circumstances and what gives them susceptibility to perhaps having these types of thoughts or feelings, it kind of makes sense that if you've had it throughout your life, this sense of a lack of belonging, that when you're in the workplace, which is just an extension of your larger life, that these issues will arise, and certain cohorts of people are more likely to experience it, and they might experience it in a different way.
Yeah,
So the strategies we then use to rectify it might have to be different to reflect the lived experience or the different lived experiences of people who are suffering from it now.
for sure.
And also think we have to be careful. I touched on this a little bit earlier about medicalizing the term or pathologizing
Yeah.
what can be just normal feelings of, oh, I'm unsure about this, or this is outside my comfort zone, or this is something I'm not used to, so I'm feeling hesitant.
Yes.
And I think everybody has those feelings from time to time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And whenever you're tackling anything new, you can sort of have those feelings, can't you? But I think the difference is when that it's like ebb and flow, when that wave comes upon you, and then when you finally sort of figure out what you are doing, it subsides. Whereas with imposter syndrome, even if it's on a subconscious level, it's like you said that each character It's always there lingering in the background.
Yeah,
I honestly, from a personal perspective, for me, that kind of the superhero thing of, yeah, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it, and getting more and more tasks on my plate, or being the expert where I'm sort of like, well, I'm gonna base everything on my skill set and how I know, and I have such a big knowledge bank, and therefore people who may kind of come up against me and say, well, you don't belong, I can have a better argument with them to say, well, actually I do.
yeah,
But I shouldn't even have to be doing that in the first place. So what kind of specific examples have you had in the past that you can sort of part wisdom on?
yeah. I think for me, it was particularly prevalent in the early stages of my career because, as I mentioned, I think in earlier episodes, when I got to the workplace or when I got to university, while I had a certain level of academic attainment, I didn't have certain cultural aspects which I looked around me and I thought these are highly successful people who have done lots of different things, who know lots about culture, which I didn't know. So it was that feeling that there's a gap there, and because there's that gap, I don't map onto this organization. And then I went through this, intense period where I was trying to gather in as much information as possible to plug that gap, and always in the back of my mind thinking, "Oh, this is at some point people are going to know, and I'm going to be ejected from the tribe."
So it's sort of almost like a social anxiety of being found out that you weren't the same as everybody else, so you
Yeah,
didn't fit that mold,
yeah.
which you were sort of trying to measure yourself up against, essentially, right?
I think that's right, and that you sort of mentioned there's different categories of imposter syndrome, and one of them's the superhero,
Mm,
where you take on everything, and you are the person who will, if there's a project, you're the first person to raise your hand because you're at some point you need to either stay ahead of people finding out that you're not up to the job, or it's part of your basis of what your worth is.
yeah,
And I think it's really interesting point about what you attach worth to. Because if you think about it, everybody has inherent worth. You shouldn't have to justify what your value is as a person. It should just be there.
yeah,
And the fact that you've got the job in the first place, well, obviously companies have hiring processes. They're not going to just give you the job because they think, oh, you're a nice person, but vaguely incompetent.
yeah,
They're going to give you the job because they've got a specific, or the company's got a specific issue that they need addressing, and you've got the skills and you've got the knowledge and you've got the expertise that can help the company achieve that goal.
yes,
But I think in sometimes in work, because it can be quite hierarchical,
yes,
it's like your worth as a human being depends on what your skills are or what your, where you are in the pecking order. Whereas in reality, everybody has inherent worth.
yeah.
And if you're in an organization which celebrates that, then you can go quite a long way to making people feel comfortable and safe at work. And I know it seems like a very overblown term, of safety at work, but I think psychologically,
You need to feel
yeah,
safe, absolutely. And in fact, that sort of touches upon, I know you said, work is part of a big part of our lives. At the end of the day, most of us spend 8, 9, even longer hours, either at work or working with people that we're connected to at work, but in our out of office locations, essentially. And it's sort of like, because of that time spent together and the dynamics of what the rules are within that organization, if you get triggered at some point between getting criticism and then having praise, apparently there is a link there to how your family actually brought you up. If you come from a family where there was a lot of flip-flopping between praise and then being criticized, it is a trigger to actually bring up that imposter syndrome, and also is linked to self-efficacy as well. So
yeah,
if you sort of don't feel safe at work, like you're saying, and you find yourself where you're being triggered, and you're going back mentally to the feelings that you had when you were growing up, that is also something that can really, impact you. And maybe you didn't have imposter syndrome, maybe it was lying low for a while, and then sort of all of a sudden that safety isn't there anymore, so it comes back up again.
yeah. And also, if you make people safe at work, it gives them the capability of focusing their full attention on the work in front of them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So rather than being in this state of hypervigilance, thinking loads of different thoughts rather than what's in front of you, you give people the bandwidth to bring their full selves and their full talents
Yeah.
to the organization, and that surely must be a good thing.
Without thinking, should I be saying this word, or should I just keep quiet, or should I not put my hand up? And you know, oh my goodness, I tell you what, I would never forget this in my early 20s, writing an email to try and express something that I thought should be called out. I think I
Mhm.
spent about 4 hours
Yeah,
editing this email.
and I think, sorry to interrupt you, particularly with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, I think it can be very difficult for people to express their true good intentions because they're so hung up about how will this be received? What happens if I use the wrong language? Will I get picked
Yes,
apart for this?
yeah.
Um,
And how's it going to affect me in the long run
yeah,
beyond this one situation?
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And Sav, what I found really fascinating was you mentioned different categories
yeah.
of imposter syndrome, and I think you mentioned the expert and the superhero, but there are a couple of other types, I
There
believe.
are definitely, I mean, the perfectionist, I think this is a huge one. That feeling of continually never fe you know, never satisfied and always feeling like your work could be better. Because, again, it comes down to that feeling of, "It's not enough, I'm not enough." So, you could be, your colleague could spend 2 hours doing a presentation and preparing that, and you could be up overnight basically trying to prepare for it and ultimately get to burnout. So that's one of the biggest ones, and that really impacts your self-efficacy because you're continually trying to, produce something perfect, but really there is really no such thing,
Yeah,
right?
the enemy
So
of good.
absolutely. There's also, I think we talked about the superhero, we've talked about the expert. There's also the natural genius where you're actually so clever and you self-sabotage. So you actually set yourself these ridiculous goals that you're not gonna achieve, which is sort of a vicious cycle of, setting yourself up to fail, essentially. And then the soloist, and I've definitely felt the soloist thing, and this really comes back to scarcity mindset, where it's sort of you don't want to work with people necessarily because you're either afraid that they'll find you out to be a fraud, or you don't feel like there's enough to go around and things are operating from that finite pie
Finite
sort of.
pie.
Yeah, exactly. So you're just like, no, I want to keep it all to myself and I'll do it all, you know. I mean, these are just categories that, come up time and time again. I'm sure there's different sort of intersectional sections of what that could look like, but they're the main categories that research has definitely put out there.
I thought the soloist, I really resonate with that. For me, a really big thing is asking for help
Oh, yeah.
because it's not something, or I feel very uncomfortable
It's like
doing
a
that.
weakness, right?
Yeah.
Do
Rather
you see it?
rather
Yeah.
than what I'm doing is asking for collaboration and being collaborative and being part of a team, I think is a really great thing.
Absolutely. But it takes courage to do that when you're coming from the viewpoint that if I can't do this alone, I might not be good enough.
Yeah.
And it's funny how people that don't suffer from imposter syndrome don't see it that way. They look at it in terms of collaboration, like you said, and that's great, and being part of a team. But I tell you what, why don't you and I go out to the football field and I'll represent one whole team and you try and represent the other, and we'll see how quickly we
We
burn
get there,
out.
yes.
That might be an interesting
Yeah.
experiment. Oh my goodness.
Also, I think we touched upon it's persistent feelings in spite of evidence to the contrary, or convincing evidence to the contrary. I think there's also the situation where your brain or yourself is telling you that there are parts of your knowledge or your skill set which need improving
Yeah.
for you to fit the job description.
Yeah.
And that links back to the normal feelings of I don't quite know enough about an area, or my knowledge or my skill in this particular aspect of the job needs improving.
Yeah.
But that doesn't equate, I think, in my mind, to imposter syndrome. And that's why we have to be careful with the labels that we put on ourselves, because our minds will seek out information to
Yes.
support what we're telling it.
Well, that's so interesting because the action is the same, but the intention is different.
Hmm.
So if you're starting a new job and things operate differently and you need to figure out how things work, right? You may be feeling a bit vulnerable at the time, and you may think, oh, I need to really step up because I don't there's a bit of a gap that I can see, and that's natural because you're starting something new. If your intention and the way you perceive that is, I'm starting something new and I need to really get my skates on and really give it my all to get on board on this fast train, to be part of this organization, that's great. If you're doing that very same action because you feel like your cup isn't full, that's imposter syndrome. So
For
I
sure.
think the action is exactly the same, but the intention and the goal is different.
Yeah,
So
I think that's really well summed up. And to get a sense, I think, of where you sit within this potential topic, it's really helpful to have allies in the workplace or people you can get a sounding from that you can rely upon,
absolutely.
as well as even asking for feedback during either your appraisal process or to your senior manager or to your peer group in senior leadership team can give you objective evidence about where you're actually sitting within your own skill set or your own personal ability.
100% agree with that. I think that external affirmation of really truthfully looking at the data and seeing whether or not you're not measuring up, or whether or not you need to upskill somewhere or need to step up somewhere, and having an ally to actually objectively tell you that from an external point of view is super, super important. And having a mentor would be, I think that's something that a lot of us lacked when we were starting out back
And
in the
mentoring can
90s
be
and 80s,
such a great thing. It can be
Absolutely.
so useful to people's careers, not only for the mentee but also for the mentor.
100%, 100%.
Lots of successful people that I can see are really happy when other people succeed. And that goes back to the abundance mindset. They're not a direct threat. The mentee is not a direct threat to them. They're somebody they want to see grow and want to see flourish because they know when the company grows, everybody benefits from that.
Yeah. There's a sort of halo effect of it all, isn't there? That just goes around then. So, I suppose all in all, if we're looking at the external factor of all of this, we've got that, seek allyship, see if you can get a mentor. We've also got that internal chatter of quietening down the negative talk and maybe pepping it up. You're very good at this. You talk about this all the time, don't you, Michael? It's the practicing kindness and being
And
grateful.
compassion.
Yeah, you've got to be compassionate about how you, I don't know, how
How
you
you
approach things.
Yeah, and see yourself and particularly your younger self as well. Um, I think that in sort of various forms of therapy, they mention a technique where you, as your current self, with all the knowledge and the skills and the experience, look back on your younger self and visualize just putting your arms around your younger self and saying you did the best you could with what you had available. You didn't fail. This was just part of your journey, and just really comforting that side of you. And these can be very difficult, or the very difficult processes to go through, and they
Yeah,
can be something that you have to just keep plugging at,
yeah.
because it might take a very long time to get to the place where you are feeling you're feeling centered and in that place of power, rather that in that sort of crouching in the cave of fear.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's going to be a really fantastic topic to dive deeper into in our next session. I think that sort of your brain will believe everything you tell it, and if you can go beyond the thought of belief and make yourself actually feel like that sensory feeling of
Yeah,
giving yourself a hug, I think it's so much more impactful and will take you
yeah,
onto forgiveness and being more compassionate towards yourself, etc. Um, so we've said the external world and the mentor and allies helping you. We've talked about being good to yourself and practicing compassion onto yourself. And I think the third point that we were sort of discussing about how you can sort of help yourself manage imposter syndrome is really that old adage, really of know thyself, right? You've got to know yourself to be able and pick up on when the imposter syndrome has taken over. So you've got markers in place of, actually, I'm doing this again and I need to just take a breath, right? And just spot check. Am I?
step back,
Yep.
assess it objectively, keep your emotions quiet, keep your mind quiet, and look at what's in front of you. Um, I think it's in the basis of a very centered place to be.
Absolutely. So, gang, we are going to move on to part 2, diving deeper more into the imposter syndrome and how it affects you as an individual, and dive deeper into some of those tactics of how you can help yourself to really think about what the markers are and what you can do to overcome some of this stuff. So we'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Your Day, Your Rules podcast with Sev and Michael.
Before we go, we'd like to say a big thank you to all of our listeners and for sharing our content with someone who needs it.
Keep spreading the word and remember to like, subscribe and follow us here and on our socials.
Until next time, if you want to go fast, go alone.
If you want to go far, go together.